When Ada agrees to follow her friend to a remote village in eastern Nigeria, she is unprepared for the mysteries hidden within its ancient traditions. One early morning, eager for adventure, she stumbles upon Kumba River, a sacred stream forbidden to visitors on a fateful market day. There, she encounters a mesmerizing mermaid adorned with 2 pythons and a chilling warning. Today is the day the Queen Mother of the Waters walks the earth. Ignorant of the village's rules, Ada must navigate an otherworldly encounter that blurs the line between myth and reality. Will her innocent curiosity awaken forces beyond her understanding? Chapter 1. The forbidden stream. The sun was only a faint glow in the sky when Ada awoke to the soft rustling of leaves outside the small clay house. The air in Amagu village was cool and crisp, carrying the earthy scent of dew-soaked soil. She stretched lazily and glanced around the room, noticing that the others were still deep in sleep. Her friend Chidinma, curled up on a raffia mat beside her, had promised to show her around the village, but Ada's restless nature wouldn't let her wait. This was her first time visiting her friend's village, and she was eager to explore its quiet beauty. Carefully, she slipped out of the house, mindful not to wake her hosts. The village was still shrouded in the faint mist of dawn, its winding dirt paths empty and peaceful. Ada wandered aimlessly until her feet brought her to a narrow path leading into the bush. A soft trickle of water caught her ear, pulling her forward like a spell. Soon, she found herself standing at the edge of a shimmering stream, its surface glowing faintly in the morning light. Her eyes widened in delight. Kumba River. Chidinma had briefly mentioned it the night before, but there had been no time for details. She hadn't said anything about it being dangerous or forbidden. The stream's clear waters called to her, the gentle current whispering secrets in a language she couldn't understand. Intrigued, Ada stepped closer, brushing past the ferns that lined the banks. Something about the place felt otherworldly, yet serene, as if time itself slowed in its presence. She was about to kneel by the water's edge when a sudden movement across the stream caught her eye. Ada froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, a figure emerged from the water, a man with shimmering skin that seemed to glisten like fish scales under the growing sunlight. His long, wet hair flowed over his shoulders, and his torso, though human, was strangely perfect, almost unnaturally so. It wasn't until her eyes fell lower that she realized his legs were not legs at all. They were a powerful, glistening fish tail that swayed hypnotically in the water. Ada stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. Before she could think to run, she noticed something even more terrifying. Coiled around each of the figure's arms were 2 massive pythons, their heads raised and their beady eyes fixed on her. "What are you doing here?" the creature asked, his voice deep and resonant, carrying an otherworldly authority. His eyes were piercing, glimmering like molten gold. I was just out for a walk," Ada stammered, unable to tear her gaze away. Her feet felt rooted to the ground, her chest tight with fear. The man frowned. "Today is Eek Market Day. No one comes to Kumba River on this day." "I didn't know," Ada whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm a visitor. I didn't mean to break any rules." The creature studied her intently, his gaze softening slightly. "You are not from this village," he said, as though finally realizing it. "That is the only reason you are still standing." Ada's knees buckled, and she nearly collapsed in relief. But her curiosity got the better of her. She glanced again at the creature's tail and the snakes, then back to his face. "Who are you?" she asked cautiously. The man's lips curled into a faint smile, revealing sharp, pearly teeth. "I am Madhu," he said, his voice tinged with pride. "A servant of the Queen Mother of the Waters. Today is the day she walks the earth, and this river is her sacred path. You should not be here." Ada swallowed hard, her throat dry. "The Queen Mother? Is she?" Is she like you? Madhu tilted his head, a flicker of amusement in his golden eyes. No, he replied. She is far greater than anything you can imagine. If she finds you here. His voice trailed off ominously, leaving the rest to Ada's imagination. Please, Ada pleaded. I didn't mean to offend. I'll leave right now. But before Madhu could respond, the water behind him began to ripple violently, as though something massive was rising from the depths. His expression darkened. You're too late, he said quietly. She is here. The last thing Ada saw before the world spun into chaos was a towering figure emerging from the river, crowned in shimmering water lilies. Her presence overwhelmed the Queen's fury. The world seemed to hold its breath as the towering figure rose from the water. Ada's heart pounded in her chest, her legs trembling as though the earth itself had turned to quicksand. The figure was impossibly tall, her form shimmering like liquid gold. She wore a crown of water lilies and pearls, and her presence exuded a regal, almost suffocating power. The Queen Mother! Madhu dropped to his knees in the shallow water, bowing his head low. The two pythons slithered from his arms, sliding into the water to join their queen. Great Mother, he said reverently, his voice barely above a whisper. Ada, frozen with fear, couldn't move. The Queen Mother's gaze locked onto her, sharp and unyielding, her eyes like twin pools of endless depth. A faint smile curved her lips, but it wasn't comforting, it was predatory. You, the Queen Mother said, her voice echoing like the crash of distant waves. A mortal, standing on my sacred banks. Ada tried to speak, to explain, but the words died in her throat. Her body felt impossibly heavy, as though the very air around her had thickened. She is not of the village, Great Mother, Madhu interjected, his tone respectful but urgent. She does not know the laws. The Queen Mother's head tilted slightly, her crown of lilies trembling with emotion. Her gaze softened, but only for a moment. Ignorance is no excuse, she said coldly. Her voice seemed to flow through the air, wrapping around Ada like invisible chains. This river is mine, my sanctuary. No mortal crosses its threshold uninvited. Ada's knees finally buckled, and she fell to the ground, trembling. I didn't know, she managed to croak, her voice barely audible. I didn't mean to offend. Please, forgive me. The Queen Mother's lips curled into a cruel smile. Forgiveness, she repeated, her tone mocking. Do you think forgiveness is given so easily in my world? Madhu raised his head slightly. Great Mother, he said cautiously, she is harmless, a visitor. Perhaps her transgression is one that could be overlooked. The Queen Mother's gaze snapped to Madhu, her expression darkening. You dare suggest mercy to me, Madhu? She hissed. Have you grown bold in your service? Madhu immediately bowed his head again, his body visibly tense. I would not presume, Great Mother. The Queen Mother turned back to Ada, her eyes narrowing. You have broken sacred law, she said, her voice colder now. And for that, there is always a price. Ada's heart sank. What price? She whispered, tears welling in her eyes. The Queen Mother stepped closer, her towering form casting a shadow over Ada. The water beneath her feet rippled with each movement, as though the river itself was bowing to her presence. That, she said, her voice low and menacing, is for me to decide. Before Ada could react, the Queen Mother raised her hand, and the water from the stream surged upward like a living thing. It coiled around Ada's legs, icy and unrelenting, pulling her toward the water. She let out a panicked scream, clawing at the earth, but the Queen Mother's power was too strong. No! Madhu shouted, his voice breaking with urgency. He waded into the stream, placing himself between Ada and the Queen Mother. Please, Great Mother, allow me to speak. The Queen Mother's eyes blazed with anger, but she paused. The water froze mid-motion, holding Ada in place. Speak carefully, Madhu, she warned, her voice like the distant rumble of a storm. Madhu turned to Ada, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and determination. You must offer her something, he whispered quickly. Something of value. She only spares those who can prove their worth. Ada's mind raced, her fear clouding her thoughts. I have nothing, she cried, the water tightening around her ankles. The Queen Mother tilted her head, as though entertained by her panic. If you have nothing, she said with a smirk, then you are nothing, and the river takes what is worthless. The water surged again, dragging Ada closer to the stream's edge. Her fingers clawed at the dirt, her cries growing more desperate. Please, wait. I'll give you whatever you want. The Queen Mother stopped, her expression unreadable. Anything. Ada nodded frantically, her chest heaving. Anything. A chilling smile spread across the Queen Mother's face. Very well, she said. Your life is spared. But in exchange, you will serve me. Serve you? Ada stammered, her voice trembling. The Queen Mother's eyes glinted with cruel amusement. You will belong to the river, to me. From this day forth, you are bound to my will. No, Ada gasped, shaking her head. I can't. It is done, the Queen Mother interrupted, her voice final. She waved her hand, and the water released Ada, sending her collapsing onto the riverbank. Before Ada could catch her breath, the Queen Mother began to fade, her form dissolving into a mist that seeped back into the river. Her voice echoed through the air, sending chills down Ada's spine. You may walk the earth, girl, but know this: the river owns you now. Run from it if you like, but you cannot escape its call. The last of the Queen Mother's presence disappeared, leaving the river eerily calm once more. Ada sat trembling on the bank, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to Madhu, who stood silently, his face a mask of worry. What does she mean? Ada asked, her voice barely a whisper. Madhu looked away, his expression grim. It means your life is no longer your own, he said softly. The river will come for you, sooner or later. Before Ada could press him further, a distant rumble echoed through the air, like thunder on a clear day. Madhu's head snapped toward the sound, his golden eyes widening. She's not done, he said urgently. We need to leave. Now. And as the rumble grew louder, Ada knew her nightmare was only just beginning. The mark of the river Ada's heart was still pounding as Madhu grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. The rumbling sound in the distance grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath them like a living heartbeat. What's happening? She gasped, stumbling as she struggled to keep up with Madhu. She left her mark on you, Madhu said, his voice tight with urgency. And now the river stirs. We have to get you back to the village before it's too late. The forest around them seemed to come alive as they moved. The trees whispered in a language Ada didn't understand, their branches swaying despite the stillness of the air. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and the once soothing chirping of birds and insects had been replaced by an eerie silence. Her mark. What mark? Ada asked, panic creeping into her voice. Madhu didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at her wrist, his jaw tightening. She claimed you, he said at last. The Queen Mother rarely lets mortals go unpunished. Her mark binds you to her, and to the river. It's how she'll find you, no matter where you are. Ada's breath hitched. She looked down at her wrist, where a faint, silvery glow was beginning to take shape. It was like an intricate tattoo, curling and twisting in patterns that resembled flowing water. The lines seemed to move under her skin, shifting like currents in the ocean. What is this?" she stammered, trying to rub it away, but the glowing mark only grew brighter. "It's a tether," Madhu said, his tone grim. "The river will call to you, and when it does, you won't be able to resist." "No," Ada whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This can't be happening. There has to be a way to get rid of it." "There isn't," Madhu said sharply. "No one defies the Queen Mother and lives to tell the tale." Ada yanked her arm away from him, her panic giving way to anger. "You knew this would happen," she shouted. "You should have stopped me from coming here." Madhu's expression darkened, guilt flickering in his golden eyes. "I didn't know you would stumble into the Queen Mother's path," he said. "I warned you to leave immediately, but now that you've been marked, we have to focus on surviving." Before Ada could respond, the rumbling sound grew deafening, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake. Madhu's head snapped toward the direction of the river, his body going rigid. "She's sending her hunters," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hunters," Ada echoed, fear tightening her throat. Madhu grabbed her arm again, pulling her deeper into the forest. "Her servants, spirits of the river. They'll come for you, Ada. She doesn't let her claimed ones run free for long." The shadows around them grew darker, shifting and coiling like living things. Ada could hear strange sounds now, whispers, growls, the slithering of unseen creatures. She glanced back toward the stream, her stomach twisting in terror as she saw a figure emerging from the water. It wasn't Madhu this time. This figure was taller, more monstrous, its body covered in gleaming black scales. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its long, clawed hands dripped with water that hissed like acid as it hit the ground. "Run!" Madhu hissed, pushing her forward. Ada's legs moved before her mind could catch up, her instincts screaming for her to flee. She tore through the forest, the branches clawing at her skin and clothes as she stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind her, she could hear the hunter crashing through the undergrowth, its guttural growls growing closer with every step. "Don't stop!" Madhu yelled from behind her. Ada's lungs burned, and her vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to keep going. The forest seemed endless, the trees pressing in on her like walls. Every time she thought she'd lost the hunter, she could hear it again, its growls echoing through the trees. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, and she tumbled down a steep slope, her body colliding with rocks and roots as she fell. She hit the bottom with a painful thud, the wind knocked from her lungs. She tried to push herself up, but her body screamed in protest. Her vision spun, and her head throbbed. Above her, the trees seemed to sway and shift, their shadows growing darker and more menacing. Then she saw it. The hunter stood at the top of the slope, its glowing green eyes locked onto her. It let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through the air like a warning. Ada scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the dirt. "Madhu!" she screamed, but there was no response. The hunter leapt down the slope, landing with a thud that shook the ground. It crouched low, its clawed hands digging into the earth as it advanced toward her. Ada's heart raced, her mind screaming for a way out. But there was nowhere to run. The hunter was faster, stronger, and it was closing in. Just as its claws reached for her, a blinding light erupted from her wrist, the silvery mark glowing brighter than ever. The hunter recoiled with a screech, its body writhing as though the light burned it. The mark on Ada's wrist pulsed, sending waves of energy through the air. The hunter let out one final, agonized roar before collapsing into a pool of black water that seeped into the ground. Ada stared at her wrist in disbelief, the glowing mark slowly fading back to its faint, silvery hue. She could hear footsteps approaching, and a moment later, Madhu appeared at the edge of the slope, his face pale with worry. "You used the mark," he said, his voice filled with awe and fear. "I didn't do anything," Ada said, her voice trembling. "It just happened." Madhu helped her to her feet, his grip firm but gentle. "The Queen Mother's power is in you now," he said. "But it won't save you forever. This was only the first hunter. She'll send more." Ada's legs wobbled beneath her as she tried to process what had just happened. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Madhu's expression was grim. "We have to find a way to sever your connection to the river," he said, "before it's too late." Ada nodded, though her mind was spinning with fear and uncertainty. As Madhu led her away from the slope, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching her. And somewhere in the distance the river whispered. The parting warning Madhu stood before Ada, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the forest. His face was somber, his usually smooth and unreadable expression clouded with a mix of urgency and worry. The distant rumbling from the river had faded, but the air still felt thick, charged with a presence Ada couldn't name. "You can't stay here," Madhu said abruptly. His voice was sharp, cutting through the silence. Ada's heart sank. "You're sending me away? After everything that's happened?" "Yes," Madhu replied firmly. "The longer you remain in this forest, the more danger you invite. The Queen Mother's hunters will not stop, and I cannot protect you from everything. You must go back to the village and prepare for what is to come." "But," Ada began, her voice shaking. "There is no time to argue," Madhu snapped, his tone harsher than before. Then he softened, taking a step closer. "Listen carefully, Ada. I have two things to tell you, and you must remember them. They will determine whether you live or die." Ada swallowed hard, her chest tightening at the gravity in his voice. She nodded, her hands trembling at her sides. "First," Madhu said, his golden gaze piercing hers, "you will experience visits, unfamiliar ones. These may come as voices, as shadows, or as dreams that feel too real. The Queen Mother and her servants will not leave you alone. They will try to confuse you, to lure you back to the river." Ada's throat went dry. "What do I do?" "Whenever it happens," Madhu said, leaning in slightly, "you must say these exact words. 'I am innocent. What I don't know doesn't know me.' Do you understand?" Ada repeated the phrase under her breath, her voice trembling. "I'm innocent. What I don't know doesn't know me." Madhu nodded. "Good. Say it firmly, without fear. It will weaken their hold on you, but only for a time." Ada felt a chill run down her spine. "And the second thing?" Madhu stepped back, his fish-tail shimmering faintly in the dim light, the scales reflecting an otherworldly glow. His voice dropped to a grave tone. "There is only one way to sever your connection to the river. A sacrifice must be made on Eek Market Day, when the sun is at its peak." "A sacrifice?" Ada whispered, her pulse quickening. "Yes," Madhu said, his tone unwavering. "I will give you a list of items. These must be presented to someone who knows the traditions of this village. They will understand what must be done. If the ritual is performed correctly, your tether to the Queen Mother will be broken." Ada listened intently as Madhu began listing the items. "A white cockerel, untouched by any hand but yours. A calabash filled with water from Cumber River, taken before dawn. 7 collarnuts, split cleanly in 2. A piece of red cloth, soaked in palm oil." Madhu paused, his gaze heavy. "There is more, but the elder will guide you. Tell them the ritual must take place in the heat of the sun on Eek market day. No sooner, no later. Ada's heart raced. She repeated the list in her mind, fear prickling at her skin. How will I find someone who knows the tradition? You will know, Madhu said cryptically. Fate will guide you. But you must leave this forest now. The Queen Mother will not wait forever. Ada looked at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of reassurance. How will I even make it out of here alive? The hunters. I have already thought of that, Madhu interrupted. He gestured to the ground beside him, and one of the massive pythons that had coiled around his arms earlier slithered forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate, its body shimmering like molten gold in the faint light. This python will lead you out, Madhu said. It will shield you from the spirits that roam these woods. Follow it closely, and whatever you do, don't look back. Ada's breath hitched as she stared at the serpent, her instincts screaming to run. But Madhu's words were firm, and she trusted him, even if fear gnawed at her resolve. Before she could take a step, her gaze dropped to Madhu's lower body. His fish tail gleamed faintly in the shadows, its scales catching the soft light. A question she hadn't dared to ask suddenly spilled from her lips. "How have you been following me?" she asked, her voice low, almost accusatory. "Your legs." Madhu smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. "You're a human, Ada," he said. "I am a spirit. I have my ways." Ada opened her mouth to ask more, but Madhu raised a hand to silence her. "You don't have time for questions," he said, his tone serious again. "Remember the words I gave you. Remember the items for the ritual. And do not stop until you've left this forest." Ada hesitated, her heart heavy with gratitude and fear. "Thank you," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Madhu's expression softened, but only for a moment. He stepped back, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Go now," he said. "And Ada, don't forget. Do not look back." With that, he turned and began walking toward the stream, his fish tail swaying gracefully behind him. The python hissed softly, nudging Ada's leg as if urging her forward. Ada took a deep breath, glancing one last time at Madhu's retreating figure. Then she turned and began to run, the python slithering ahead of her, its movements eerily silent. The forest seemed alive with whispers and shadows, but the python stayed close, its presence keeping the darkness at bay. Ada's legs burned, her chest heaved, but she didn't dare slow down. As she ran, she thought she heard Madhu's voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. "Your heart is faint to overcome what is coming," he said, his tone almost sorrowful. Ada stumbled but caught herself, her mind racing with his cryptic words. What was coming? What did he mean? Before she could dwell on it, the python suddenly stopped, turning its head toward her. They had reached the edge of the forest. The sunlight beyond the trees seemed blinding after the oppressive darkness. Ada stepped forward, her feet trembling with relief. But as she crossed the threshold, she felt an overwhelming urge to glance back. "Don't look back," Madhu's voice echoed in her mind. Ada clenched her fists, fighting the temptation. Her body screamed for one last glimpse of the creature who had saved her, but she pushed forward, breaking into a run as tears streamed down her face. Behind her, the forest seemed to sigh, its shadows folding in on themselves as the python slithered back into the trees. And far away, by the sacred stream, Madhu stood silently, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You have little time," he murmured to himself, "and the river never forgets." The water rippled behind him, and a shadow loomed in its depths. The Queen Mother was watching.